Hello, everybody. Welcome back once again to Jason's ethics class. Today we are going to talk about the moral and political philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So, as I said in the in previous lectures, in this section we are going to be concentrating on a few writers in what's called the social contract theory, the tradition of what's called the social contract theory. And the social contract theory is a philosophical position that says that moral and political beliefs are based, or moral and political values are based on the set of rules that rational people would agree to on the condition that other people agree to them as well. And hopefully you see how Hobbes and Locke have fit into that tradition. And today we're going to add to that and talk about what's often considered sort of a third rail in the main sequence of social contract theorists, Rousseau. So Rousseau is easiest to understand in compare and contrast with the previous philosophers. So let's do that now. Just a brief rundown. Remember Hobbes. Hobbes thought that that life in these wondered what kind of political system could last, and he started thinking, and he wanted to think about, well, why do we begin to form governments in the first place? And to answer this question, he thought about life in the state of nature. State of nature being the conditions that people live in when there's no laws or there's no government. So, and Hobbes ended up thinking the state of nature was the worst conditions that people could live in, and that anybody who can keep us from these conditions is all right by him, deserves all of our allegiance. And he thinks that this turns out to be the king, right? Monarchy for Hobbes was the best kind of government, not because the king was born to lead us, but because it is in all of our best interests that the king sit up there on that throne and rule over us, right? And remember I said that when Hobbes thought about the state of nature and what life is like in the state of nature is going to be very, very important to all of these philosophers. So it's important to understand what they think of when they think of the state of nature, what their example is. Hobbes's example of the state of nature, remember, was England during the Civil War. Overnight, the government falls and people are killing each other in the streets, right? So skip forward to Locke. Locke, a couple generations later, is going to have a much more laid-back attitude, both towards the king and towards the state of nature. Locke thought that life in the state of nature was pretty good, actually. It wasn't too bad. That we all are really, really free and can spend our time however we like, and that life isn't so bad, Locke thought, because even in the state of nature, there are these moral rules, there are these moral rights that we all recognize, that we shouldn't tamper with each other in our life or liberty or our possessions. And Locke thought that life in the state of nature was not so bad, but it was pretty bad. And eventually what we want certain kinds of guarantees. We want institutions to guarantee our rights. We want people to protect us. We want people to write laws. We want people to be able to judge our disputes and so on, right? And we can only get this by forming a society. But Locke thought that since life was in the state of nature was actually not that bad, then we shouldn't be too afraid from time to time of having no government, right? And he thinks that a king could fulfill the role of government that he's talking about. But if the king isn't doing his job, then occasionally from time to time people might have to overthrow him. They might have to retract their consent to the government and go through periods of revolution. And for Locke, this isn't nearly as scary a proposition as it is for Hobbes. Locke thinks that life in the state of nature isn't that bad, right? So what we're going to talk about now is Rousseau. Rousseau comes then again a couple generations after Locke, right? Rousseau comes in the midst of what's often called the Enlightenment in Europe, a period of time in Europe called the Enlightenment. And this is a period of time when there is a renewed interest in the arts and in the sciences, And people especially begin to question the authority of the two main institutions of Europe during this era. That is the king and the church, right? The authority of the king and of the crown and the church all over Europe is coming under serious scrutiny, serious intellectual scrutiny. And there are a lot of intellectuals, especially philosophers and historians and so on, and artists who are taking issue with the power that is protected by the king and the church. So to understand, so let's say a little bit about Rousseau and kind of where he's coming from. Rousseau was born in Geneva, which is now part of Switzerland. Back then it was its own independent city-state, right? So he grew up. He grew up in Geneva. He spent most of his time in France. When he's born pretty well-to-do parents. He's sent to Paris for his education. While he's there, he gets in with a lot of philosophers and artists and musicians. That's actually what he goes to Paris to study, is music. And he was actually a musician of moderate success. Actually, Rousseau was. He wrote a couple of operas that were performed and were reviewed pretty well at this time. But by far, what he's known for is his historical significance, his contributions to philosophy and to politics. And he comes about an interest in philosophy purely by accident. Really, his famous story about him: he was walking across campus when he was in college to see his friend Diderot, who was in prison at the time. Right, I told you Rousseau was in some uppity types, right? So he's walking to see his friend Diderot in jail, and as he's walking across the campus, Rousseau sees this advertisement for an essay contest there on campus, right? And the topic of the essay is this. You're supposed to write 1,000 words answering this question. Has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals? In other words, we here on the college campus during the Enlightenment, it wasn't called that yet, but it would be, during this period of intellectual excitement and people questioning all the traditional powers, has this renewed fascination with the arts and the sciences and these new freedoms that we're beginning to try to claim and exercise, has that contributed to people being better human beings? The purification of morals, right? Certainly the writers of this question expected that they were going to be inundated with essays from students who would take the position of, yes, of course it has. Of course the restoration of the sciences and arts has made us better people. What's the other answer? Well, maybe they were inundated with other essays, but the only one that matters today is Rousseau's answer to this question. And Rousseau's answer to this question is no. The sciences don't make us arts and sciences don't make us morally better. And the reason why not, Rousseau says, is that human beings, he thinks, are naturally good. We are naturally excellent. And that every step of our entry into society amounts to a kind of restraint upon us, a kind of compromise. And that the more complex our society gets, the more we are restoring the arts and the sciences and convinced that only society can save our souls, Rousseau thinks the more we are corrupted. We're digging in the wrong direction, right? So Rousseau is struck with inspiration and goes home and writes this essay and, in fact, wins the essay contest. And this becomes the basis of his first book, in fact, right? So to understand how Rousseau sort of hooks, and from there he kind of launches a career as a philosopher, right, and a major intellectual heavyweight and an intellectual celebrity of his day. He was very, very well known, a very, very controversial person during his own life. He was, we'll maybe come back around to that a little bit later. So where is Rousseau coming from? Well, here's the way to think about Rousseau. If Hobbes thought of the state of nature, people's sort of natural state before they enter into society, Hobbes thought of the state of nature, when he thought of the state of nature, he thought of life during the English Civil War, right? When Locke thought of the state of nature, he thought of these stories that he's hearing coming back from the Americas, that, these frontiersmen, these people going out and staking claims and then defending their territory and not stealing other people's stuff, defending themselves when necessary, but mostly just leaving everybody alone, right? Rousseau, on the other hand, is he's reading a lot of novels and brochures written by and dispatches written from people who are sailing the world and spending a lot of time in the Caribbean and the Polynesian islands, right? And he's hearing a lot of stories of the Polynesian islanders. Remember, Kant said some disparaging things about the Polynesian islanders. I would bet you $5 that Rousseau is his source of what life is like in the Polynesian islands. Kant was a big Rousseau fan. Anyway, but Rousseau also is hearing stories about life in the Polynesian islands, and the reports he hears of life in Polynesia is that these native people, they're big, they're strong, they're well tanned. They know how to get the things they want. They walk along their day. They spend their day fishing. They eat their fish. They pull some mangoes out of the tree. They break them on the rocks. They know how to get the things that they want, right? Pardon us? So, it's warm there. These people seem big and beefy and healthier. And got to remember, Rousseau is writing in Paris in the mid-1700s, right? And if you want to be skeptical about how much civilization is improving us as human beings, Paris in the mid-1700s provides an interesting perspective on that. Because life there, even though this was the crown jewel of European learning and culture, it was really a giant toilet, right? I mean, people, like literally, like people would just go in a bucket, throw it out the window, and land on the street, right? And there's rats everywhere, and it smells real bad. And Rousseau is sickly his whole life. He has a sort of a weak physical disposition, right? So you can imagine him, on his way to see Diderot in prison, Rousseau kind of like shivering under his coat, coughing up some phlegm, kicking away a rat, and then seeing this invitation to go off on how much better civilization makes us, how much better life in the city is compared to life out in the country, right? And Rousseau is having none of that. Rousseau thinks, no, people in the state of nature, human beings out in nature, actually have something that we've lost. We in the city, in the universities, being so well educated, we have lost. We maybe have gained better minds and complicated algebra and art, but we have lost something when we left the state of nature. And Rousseau, the kind of centerpiece, of course, of the core of Rousseau's career is going to be the question of, well, how do we get that thing back? That thing that we lost whenever we moved out of the forests and into the city. How do we get that back? So he is going to follow the same tack as the previous philosophers. Rousseau's going to think about what life is like in the state of nature, and then he's going to talk about, well, what kind of government we should have, based on why it is that we leave the forest in the first place, right? Okay, so what is life like then in the state of nature? Well, you can see Rousseau as sort of a natural progression. Hobbes thought it was terrible. Locke thought it was okay. Hobbes now is going to say, it's not just okay, it's really quite good. and it's even better in a lot of ways than life in the city, right? So for Rousseau, he thinks that the previous writers were correct in some degree. They were right that the state of nature is a state of freedom. We can do whatever we want and take the things that we want from nature, and it is a state of equality. There are no born kings, there are no born servants. We are all just people trying to get by, right? So the image of the emergence of culture out of the state of nature for Rousseau is that we start out as these lone individuals wandering, sort of, you might think of the early forests of Earth, right? We are big and strong and healthy. We are cunning. We know how to get the things that we want, and we know how to plot to get what we want. So we're wandering around the forest, and in the beginning, our most basic relationships with people are very sparse, right? We come together once in a while to mate and to produce children. The men probably don't stick around for very long after that in this very early phase, right? We're much like animals, right? But that's really our just about our only social relationship, is coming together once in a while to copulate, right? Now Rousseau thinks that in the process, even in this most basic, most bare bones sort of interpersonal relationship, there begins to be this thing that develops that we are animal-like in this condition in a lot of ways, but we begin to develop something that the lower animals anyway don't have, and this is compassion. Rousseau thinks that even that the compassion that we feel for, especially for children, is something that just comes naturally to us. And he thinks that you can't even see this in some lower animals, right? In some of the non-human animals, right? You can certainly see it in primates. You can see it in a lot of mammals just naturally protect their young, right? Well, Rousseau thinks in human beings this natural sense of compassion and pity that comes to mammals generally really begins to change who we are. It begins to change how we do things. It's developed in a way that it isn't in other animals, right? And so the other important attribute that we have is that we are what Rousseau calls perfectible. That is, we are capable of getting better and better. Human beings are, and so we are in touch with these, and in the state of nature out there before we begin to emerge, even into early kinds of societies. Rousseau thinks that we are just as in touch with these sort of natural drives and natural instincts as any of the other animals. We're able to get the things that we want, do what we want, and we feel this natural condition of compassion, right? And that's going to be important. The issue of compassion is going to be an important way that he differs from Hobbes in particular, and he even calls Hobbes out by name in the writing that you read for today. He says, well, what Hobbes gets wrong is, one of the things Hobbes gets wrong is that he doesn't understand that human beings, in addition to, yes, being naturally sort of selfish and conniving, and thinking about what they need for themselves, they're also, though, they're compassionate. We feel pity towards each other, at the very least towards our children, right? And so Rousseau thinks that, well, that right there changes the whole game. That changes the whole situation if we assume that compassion comes as naturally to us as selfishness, right? So life in the state of nature, before we begin to lead into any sort of society at all, is maybe best summed up by saying that, well, people in this condition, they're happy and they're healthy. They get along pretty well, and they're healthy. It's something and physical health is something that Rousseau kind of idealizes or fetishizes, right? Him being sickly. So people in the state, they're happy and they're healthy, but they're dumb. They're intellectually incapable. They don't have they don't have culture. They don't have they don't have education. They don't have the ability to seek out those things. They're just driven from moment to moment purely by their instincts, which lead them to the things that they want, but also are limited by this sense of compassion, right? Now, well, what begins to happen? Well, we begin to have not just these very short-lived kind of sexual relationships with other people in the forest. We begin to group together. We begin to form little social groups, right? And so not just a member of the opposite sex, but maybe a few different couples, and we begin to kind of huddle together and cooperate with each other to get by in the forest, right? Now, this is the beginning, Rousseau thinks, of a society, right? We're beginning to come together and form these little social bonds. And these social bonds, rather than just being people kind of suspiciously clinging together for survival the way that Hobbes thought they were, these original little cells of human beings that begin to stick together, Rousseau thinks are also brought together by this natural sense of compassion that we have for each other. We want to help each other, right? Now, so we begin to leave the state of nature. And why this happens, we'll get to. But Rousseau thinks that as we leave the state of nature, and in fact, as we get further away from the state of nature, what happens is that we begin to be alienated from our natural instincts. Those natural instincts that served us so well out there in the forest, we begin to not have to use those as much because we are dividing labor, we are depending on other people, and so on. The jack of all trades that we have to be out when we're on our own in the forest, we don't have to be that jack of all trades anymore. We don't have to learn how to do everything. We begin to divide up labor, and there's one person who fishes, and there's one person who picks berries, and so on, and one person who makes clothes, and so on. So we don't have to do it all. There's people for that, right? And then later on, much later down the road, when there begins to be political institutions, there begins to be police, there begins to be a king, and so on. These institutions, in part, they begin to take care of us. They begin to tell us, well, you don't have to worry about that anymore. You just work on your little farm and concentrate on paying your taxes, right? That's all you need to do, right? The more and more we do this, Rousseau thinks, well, we don't exercise our instincts. We don't exercise in the same way that we don't exercise our muscles. They become weak. If we don't exercise our instincts, they also become weaker. And Rousseau thinks that this is a process of nothing short than domestication, right? That human beings become domesticated. And he thinks that as they move into societies, they become more and more domesticated. And he says that like any animal, as you become domesticated, you become smaller and weaker, right? Now, this idea of domestic animals being smaller and weaker requires maybe a little bit of explanation. These days, if you go to a farm, particularly a factory farm, you're going to find pigs that are 2 or 3 times the size of like any pig you would see out, any sow anyway that you would see out in the wild, right? That's because of all the steroids and antibiotics they pump into them, right? That's factory farming. If you've ever been to a traditional farm, an organic farm, Rousseau you'll know that Rousseau has a point that because of the process of natural selection, the animals that are able to get by out in the forest, the bigger ones produce more and they live longer, and the smaller ones, the weaker ones die out, right? Well, that condition is kind of lifted in the farm setting. So smaller animals can be raised and get by too. So and breed with each other, right? So the animals that you see on natural organic farms are smaller than the animals you see out in the wild, right? And that's the point that Rousseau is making. So And he thinks the same thing happens to human beings. We become smaller and weaker, and we become dependent the same way that animals on a farm become dependent on the farmer to feed them, and they don't know how to find their food anymore. Human beings, same way. The more we become dependent on other people, whether it's other people in our little tribe or people or our king to feed us and provide us with food, the more we're becoming dependent. Smaller and weaker we'll get weaker physically, we'll get weaker mentally, right? So let's take a brief rundown of the notes so far. So this is Rousseau's idea of the state of nature, that it is a condition of freedom and equality. It's free to take things we want, and we're equal with other people in that condition. We are in touch with our natural instincts in the state of nature, he says. In particular, we are strong, physically strong, we're cunning, we know how to get the things that we want, but we're also compassionate. We feel a natural compassion and pity for our fellow human beings. People in this state, Rousseau thinks, they're happy and they're healthy, in a lot of ways happier and healthier than civilized people. But people in the state of nature they're dumb and they're limited. They're not intellectually all they could be. We'll get to that. We'll get to how they fix that in a second. But when we leave the state of nature, there are good reasons to leave in the state of nature. But leaving the state of nature requires that we become smaller and weaker and more dependent on other people to provide the things that we need. Okay, so it's a reasonable question at this point, one that was asked to Rousseau's face by some of his contemporaries. It's a reasonable question at this point. Well, if life in the state of nature is so flippin' good, why do we ever leave it, right? One of the people in Rousseau's own time that put this to him was the philosopher and social critic Voltaire. Perhaps you've heard of him. Voltaire and Rousseau had a very famous public rivalry. Voltaire really kind of despised Rousseau. Rousseau took himself very, very seriously, and he was constantly telling people how it should be very stridently. And so he was a great target for mockery. He was a lot of fun to make fun of, right? And Voltaire had a great time, as a satirist and a wit, right? He had a great time making fun of Rousseau, who took himself so seriously, right? And one of the and actually wrote quite a bit attacking the theories of Rousseau. And one of the things that Voltaire says to Rousseau on this very issue, he says, well, if life in the state of nature is so good, why do we ever leave it? Voltaire says Rousseau's work is really an argument for just ripping off your clothes and running off into the forest, right? That is not really fair to, we can say a lot of things about Rousseau, but that's not really fair to Rousseau's position, because Rousseau recognizes that this question needs to be answered. Well, why do we leave the state of nature? And he says it comes down to the fact that, we are limited in every way. Not in every way. In many ways, we are limited in the state of nature. We're limited, especially mentally, intellectually, as I said, right? And that we, in the same way that we have a kind of natural drive for anything that we need, whether it's food or water or sex or anything else that we need to propagate ourselves, right? Rousseau thinks that also part of our, compassion, another part of our nature, right? Rousseau thinks that we also have a natural drive for self-improvement. We naturally want to become better, and when we see ways that we can become better, we are naturally sort of drawn to those ways, right? And the truth is, Rousseau says, there are some things that societies give us that we can't get any other way. There are some things that some things that are really, really good for us that we need as human beings that we are only going to get with human interaction. And in fact, we're only going to get with increasingly complex human interaction, right? Until eventually we're in society, right? But Rousseau thinks, and this is sort of what he's famous for sounding the alarm on, is that, well, we need to understand, though, that contrary to what a lot of people of my era will tell you, Rousseau would say, contrary to what a lot of people will tell you, society and civilization is not this unlimited virtue. It's not wonderful in every way, and he wants to point out that it's actually a trade-off. There are certain things we gain by entering into society, but there are certain things, very important things, that we lose. And we need to think about how it is that we can maintain or resurrect some of the things that we lose when we form society, right? So let's get a rundown of what things Rousseau thinks we gain and what things he thinks we lose. Okay, so let's talk about, from Rousseau's perspective, what things we gain and lose, and what things we lose when we enter into society. So, here are the advantages of society. Here are the things that we get that we need. He thinks in the first case we get language. It's only whenever we encounter other people that we begin to need to communicate, and it's only through a need to communicate that we begin to formulate a language. Why is that so important? Well, it's only whenever we have the medium of language that we begin to be able to organize our thoughts in a way that allows us to reason in a complex way. So think about it this way: that you're gonna take some route to work today, right? So a friend's gonna pick you up from at your house from work and take you to work, right? But then the friend calls in sick, right? The friend can't take you. So now you have to think of how you're going to get to work and what route you're going to take to work. You can take the bus, you can take an Uber, you're going to take what, right? And maybe you don't have a lot of money, right? So maybe that's to the bus, but then that's an argument for the bus. But then you think, well, yeah, but maybe you can borrow a little money because you need to be there on time, and the bus is going to get you there, hours from now, right? And so on. So you're doing this little mental negotiation, right? You're thinking things through. You're reasoning your way to a conclusion, right? Well, now think for a second. Stop to reflect for a second how hard it would be to have a complex conversation with yourself like that if you don't have language, right? That whole time that you were just talking to yourself about how you're going to get to work, what language were you thinking in? You're probably thinking in English. Unless you're from another country, from a non-English speaking country, maybe you were thinking in English, even if you weren't. But maybe you were thinking in your foreign tongue, whatever. You were thinking in some language. And now consider for a second how hard it would be to have a complex conversation like that, even within your own head, with yourself, to reason in a complex way, without there first being some sort of medium of language, right? So language actually then allows us to reason in the way that we're familiar with. And furthermore, it is only by interaction with other people that we begin to cultivate our natural sense of pity and compassion into a real moral sense, into a real sense of right and wrong. Not just, well, this feels bad, and this feels good, and I feel bad for that person, or I don't feel bad for that person, but begin to think really think carefully about, well, under what conditions do I need to do this thing that maybe under certain conditions seems like the wrong thing, right? And so on, right? So it is. So those are the advantages of society, and for Rousseau thinks that this is, this idea of both reason and sentimentality sort of developed into a sense of reasoning about morality. This is the heart and soul of the human spirit as we now know it today, right? We're no longer this thing that just wanders the forest and takes whatever he needs. We are this. We can see before our eyes that we are this being capable of wonderful leaps of reason and profound sort of moral action, right? So Rousseau thinks that this is something worth fighting for. These are very, very important. But it comes with some problems. The problems are probably going to seem familiar to you, having come this far into the lecture. But the disadvantages of society are as follows. There is a lack of freedom, that we are, out in the forest, we are free to do whatever we want and take whatever we want. But here in society, we are limited by the laws of society, right? If I'm wandering around the forest, I can reach up into the tree, pluck out an apple, stick it in my mouth, and eat it. If I'm walking through schnooks or deerbergs, save a lot, right? And I pick up a apple and I shove it in my mouth. I better have some money to pay for that apple, or else, that's called grazing in the supermarket business. It's also known as stealing. You can't just pop things into your mouth and then not pay for them, right? So you're less free in society. You have to conform to the rules, or else there are going to be problems. Furthermore, as we talked about, as we begin to socialize, we become dependent on others. We begin to specialize. There begins to be this division of labor, and we begin to specialize in certain things. And if I know how to, if I'm the fisherman, I go out and I catch fish. I don't have to make shoes anymore, or build houses, or anything like that, or raise children, or find water, or any of the other things that go on in our little village, right? So as villages become more and more complex, people specialize more and more, and the more we specialize on one thing, the more we're not doing those other things, right? In the midst of all of this, as I've said before, Rousseau thinks, he really worries that we are becoming alienated from our instincts, that we are no longer, that we're no longer using our instincts to get the things that we want, and so they leave us. They become, they atrophy. They become weaker. We don't use our instincts, and they begin to drift away. So, as I said, the central question of Rousseau's his whole career really is there any way to get all of these advantages without any of these disadvantages? Now, the answer to his question, from his perspective anyway, he thinks the answer is yes. His answer of how this can be so, how it is that we get all of the advantages of society without there being any of the disadvantages, is it's peculiar. It's a little odd, and a lot of people have really struggled. Not just students. A lot of people at every level of reading Rousseau have struggled to really make sense of what he does next. So I think that okay. Before we go any further, today's attendance password is Father for Father's Day. Oh. Okay. So if you followed the lecture this far, now we're going to introduce the villain in Rousseau's story. The villain in Rousseau's story, in a word, is inequality. Rousseau wonders how we can get all of the things that we want from society without sacrificing any of these important things. And to answer that question, he wants to know, well, why is it that we begin to sacrifice those things? Why is it that we become dependent on others, and we become alienated from our instincts, and so on, right? And Rousseau's answer to this question is that, well, it all comes down to inequalities. That from the moment that we enter into any sort of social relationships with other people, whether it is out there in the forest at the beginning of time, or it is now today when you meet somebody new, he thinks you are confronted by inequality. Maybe the person is taller than you. Maybe the person is not as good looking as you. Maybe the person is smarter than you, right? But maybe you have more money than the other person, right? There are all these different ways that we begin to measure ourselves against other people, right? And Rousseau thinks that it is these ways that we then measure ourselves as to the detriment of others. We begin to realize, well, wait, we become anxious about the ways that we're not as good as others, and then also anxious about preserving the advantages that we do have. That's what begins to really create and then begins to compound these losses that he's talking about, right? It is through inequality, for instance, that the king comes to power. Some ruler, the local autocrat, comes to power and declares himself that he is the leader now, and that you must work for me. You must work on your little farm and pay your taxes. And then if I ever call you up to fight a war, you have to go because you are my subject, right? And Rousseau sees this example of inequality, which he thinks is absolutely ghastly. The idea of, it's interesting. I mean, he's a man way ahead of his time because Rousseau seems to be as appalled by the idea of a king as anybody in the modern era in the United States is, right? I mean, if he seems like a person who was thrown back in time. He doesn't at all seem like a person of his time who was just sort of raised with, oh, sure, there's king after king. No matter where you go around Europe, of course, the royals rule, right? That's what they do. He seems, Rousseau, this never seems like a natural idea to him, right? And he thinks that, this modern political relationship we have, where one person or one small group of people have all the stuff and wield all the political power and just through brute force make everybody follow their rules. This is only the most horrible and modern sort of example of this problem that has haunted us from the moment that we began to form little bands of human beings out there in the forest, is we are constantly confronted with our inequalities to other people. And people are, as I said, we're insecure about them. Other people take advantage of them, and they just cause problems the whole way down, right? So how do we then, the question becomes then, how do we eliminate inequality in our society, right? Well, Rousseau to this says that we need to do it by, in effect, we need to do it by taking this attitude that we have, or that they had circa, 1750, the attitudes that they had that were focused on the king, that, well, maybe we like him and maybe we don't, but we have to submit to him because he is the king. Rousseau says, transfer all of those attitudes, and instead of placing them on a king, place them on the attitude of the whole society, right? A sort of democratic attitude of the spirit of the whole nation or the whole city-state or whatever, right? So instead of thinking about what does this one person who's in power want and how can I please him, think about, well, what does the whole society want and how can I do my part to please the whole society, right? And this collective attitude, this collective this collective spirit of the whole society, Rousseau calls the general will, and we'll get into, as best we can, we'll get into what that means in a second. But first, let me bring you up to date on the notes. Rousseau says all the disadvantages of society are caused by inequality, and that we need to form a society that is aimed at eliminating then disadvantages. If we're going to get back to things that we lost moving into society, we need to form one that's aimed at eliminating disadvantages. And we do this by giving ourselves over to the general will. Now let's talk a little bit about this thing, the general will. So the general will for Rousseau is the sum total of the collective desires of a society. Let's put aside for a second the complicated question of what constitutes a society, and imagine we can answer that question easily. We know what a society is, and and say that we have a little society here, right? And that there are certain rules in place to make the society move better. There are rules about who gets to own what and who has access to the laws, and what the laws say about trade, and what the laws say about, staying out late at night, all this other stuff, right? Now, Rousseau kind of takes for granted here an idea that really gathered steam in Locke previously. Locke, remember, said that the power of any governing authority, even the king, who maybe wants to pretend that he's above things like this, but Locke said the power of any governing authority, it's true now, always has been true, comes from the people of the governed, right? The consent of the people who are governed, right? And Rousseau takes for granted this idea that there is no legitimate power. There's no power, period, without the people in a society deciding that they're okay with some group of people making the laws and enforcing the laws and so on, right? So imagine we have our little society here, and we know who makes the laws and who enforces the laws and so on, right? And one day, the person who's in charge, say it's a king, decides that he wants to build a new bridge, right? And that he's going to build a new bridge as a bridge with this other land, this other country, let's say, and we all need to stop working on our farms, and we all need to go and work for him to build this bridge. It's going to be backbreaking labor, maybe, and so on, right? So, how do we reason about whether or not we want to go and give our support to this bridge, give our support to the king, and do what he tells us? We could instead revolt, right? How do we reason about that? Well, there are a couple ways we might reason about it. We might say, well, now, really, that's not how I want to spend my time making a bridge. I'm a carrot farmer. My passion is with the soil. And so I would prefer to stay on my little carrot farm and raise my carrots and not go build a bridge, right? So that would be you or me, right? Sort of deciding, making political decisions based on what's good for me, right? Well, there's problems with that, and the problems with that ought to be clear, right? But from Rousseau's perspective, the problems with that is that, well, that's the kind of attitude, though, that's only going to play more and more into these inequalities that he's so afraid of. The more, for instance, that rich people don't want to share their wealth or do anything that might result in them having less wealth, the more our inequalities and the current construction of our society with its inequalities, the more that's just going to be perpetuated, right? The other attitude you might have about the building of that bridge and lending your time to it, you might say, well, it's okay. So you might say it this way. You might say, well, hey, it's in my interest to do that because you might think about how it's in your interest to have access to other markets and the other land via the bridge. And you might talk to your other farmers and the other little traders in your area and say, hey, that bridge is really going to be in our interest. We should really lend our support to that bridge, right? To build the building of that bridge, right? Rousseau says you're still doing it wrong, right? This is not quite yet what I'm talking about, because what all that really is getting people to back up your own personal interests, right? You just decided this was in your own personal interest, and that you're getting other people to think about their own personal interests, and it just so happens that you're all sort of rowing in the right direction, right? The way to do it, Rousseau says, is to tap into this thing that is harder to access than either your personal will or the will of the people around, the will of the few people around you, maybe a lot of people around you, whatever, right? But instead of thinking about that, we should think about the society as a whole. Does the society as a whole need a bridge? Does it benefit from a bridge? And what does the society need? And is a bridge the best way to effectuate that need, right? to meet that need. And then we might loan our support to the bridge, not out of any sense of protecting our own interest, even in groups, but out of the sense of, well, this is the sacrifice that needs to be made because the society as a whole needs a bridge, right? And that kind of thing is that's good. Rousseau thinks that is thinking about, kind of best we can, tapping into the general will and lending our political support to something based on our understanding of what direction the society as a whole is moving, right? Now, Rousseau thinks then the next step is, what we would have then is we would have a society where there is a king, but there are people thinking about lending or retracting their support for that king based on their understanding of the needs of the society as a whole. So Rousseau says we're right there. We're right on the verge of what he's really talking about, and that is just throwing out the spare parts. Just get rid of the king, right? Get rid of the king, then you have a society that who's insofar as it has institutions and decision makers and maybe representatives, maybe not. We'll talk about that a little bit. It's going to be making decisions based on we don't have to interpret the general will through the head of the king. Instead, we can just vote on the general will as we, the citizens, understand it. What is best for the society as a whole, and just do that, right? Now, how do we make this exist in real life? That's a good question. Rousseau is less interested in constructing a specific kind of government more than he is for providing a sort of way of thinking about a future government, right? And the way of thinking about a future government and the individual's place within the society ruled by that government is akin to the one of the metaphors that's used a lot with Rousseau is think of a flock of geese, right? That there is a flock of geese, and if you've ever watched a flock move over the landscape, you realize that they are capable of making decisions as a group, right? They're capable of making group decisions, and they appear, they can move over a landscape like a manta ray, right? And it's constructed of individual birds, right? But once those birds come together in a certain way, they're able to form this collective being, right? Rousseau thinks the same thing can happen with human beings, that when we come together to form a society, if we form that society in the right way, we can form this collective being, and this collective being then can rule our society in a way that is going to be wiser than the rule of any one individual. Okay. And when we do, if we're able to do this, if we're able to figure out the general will, what the direction needs to be for the whole group, and we are able to come together and sort of dissolve our individual wills into this collective will. If we're doing this properly, then we're like the birds whose individual wills have been dissolved into the flock, right? And we are going to be making decisions as a whole group rather than just as individuals within a group. The individual birds might fly out of the flock, but it's not in their best interest, right? Then they're out on their own. They don't have the protection of the flock. They don't have the ability to appear as this one big being, right? So so when we do this, when we dissolve our individual wills entirely over into the general will, we form a collective being, Rousseau thinks. And he calls this being the sovereign, right? He doesn't choose that name at random. Anybody remember how we used this word sovereign before in this section of class? Anybody? Okay, yes? Yes, that's right. Hobbes talked about the sovereign. Remember, Hobbes said Hobbes's name for the the one person that he thought that needed to rule the government with absolute authority, he called that person the sovereign, right? And we can never question the authority of the sovereign. We can never try to borrow or eliminate or erode any of the powers of the sovereign. His word goes. His word is law. Well, Rousseau is going to borrow that word. He's going to co-opt that word from Hobbes, grab it and pull it away from him. He's going to say, okay, yeah, we agree. The sovereign is going to rule our two societies with absolute authority. The difference, Rousseau says, is my sovereign is not going to be one individual who rules with absolute authority. My sovereign is going to be the collective will of the whole society. Right. So, catch up on the notes. So the general will is the sum total of the collective desires of a society, and we unite with the general will to form a collective being that Rousseau calls the sovereign. Okay, so the general will is a weird idea. That is the general will is probably the most problematic idea that's that's found in Rousseau, the most controversial one. And people generally are not sure exactly how to take it. Here's what Rousseau says about the general will. He says, if we can do this, if we can figure out this general will and have the right attitude towards it, this is going to fix all of our problems. We are all going to be we're going to be as free as we were in the state of nature now. We're going to be able to be in society, but still be as free as we were in the state of nature. How so? Well, Rousseau says, because inequalities are going to be completely eliminated. There are no inequalities when you come together to form the general will. When you have a society that is ruled by the general will, that maybe there are some inequalities, but those inequalities, they are going to be limited maybe only to those that are absolutely necessary for the society to function, and they're going to be as much as we possibly can minimized. And so we're going to be, since there are no inequalities, a lot of the problems that we had in other kinds of societies, dysfunctional kinds of societies, they are going to arise. So the problems of being dependent and the problems of being out of touch with our instincts and so on, for Rousseau, these problems, these are not going to be as big of problems as they were, right? Why not? Well, I mean, what we can, the best we can say about that is that, well, we can be absolutely sure this is the best we can do, right? That there, once we have decided there are as few, really engineered our society to have as few inequalities as possible, then we can we can trust in the idea that that this is as free as we can be in society. Whether or not we can be perfectly, as free as we were in the state of nature, is open to some dispute. And when Rousseau says that yes we can, he might be engaging in a little bit of hyperbole. And the advantage of doing this, that's one big advantage, is that we are able to get back a lot of the things that we lost coming into society. The other, another big advantage of having the general will rule our society is, as I said before, Rousseau thinks that this general will is going to be wiser than any individual in society. This is like a collective being. It's like everything coming together. It's going to be not only smarter, but it's also going to be it's going to have better instincts with regard to, for instance, compassion and so on, right? That it's going to be the best of us. That coming together into groups and making decisions in this way as a whole group is going to bring out the absolute best in us. And he, in fact, has an almost religious attitude towards this general will. He thinks that that we ought to give ourselves over to it entirely, the way that previous generations and previous societies gave themselves over entirely to a god. We should give ourselves, this is the god of the new political era, is the will of the people. Well said. And Rousseau says that we need, and our commitment to this general will needs to be all the way. We need to commit to it the entire way, and we have to be willing to sacrifice anything that the general will demands of us, right? If we're going to build the right kind of society, right? And you can, and if we're doing it right, then we know everybody is in the same position as us. Everybody is equally sort of dissolved into the general will, so there are no inequalities, right? So we need to be willing to sacrifice all rights. Hopefully a lot of those rights come back to us in the form of laws and maybe a Bill of Rights that the sovereign will then conduct through some sort of governmental institutions that it establishes, right? But at the end of the day, if the general will says that certain people need to sacrifice certain things, then they have no right to disagree. And in fact, they should enthusiastically agree because, hey, that's what's best for society, right? And Rousseau says that anybody who knows the general will but disagrees with it or wants to go against it, is forced to obey, which Rousseau says in one of his most notorious passages. He says, which means nothing less than the person is forced to be free. Which is kind of a bit unnerving bit of doublespeak, right? You're being forced to be free, right? But a lot of people have sent a shiver up a lot of people's spines over the years, especially the next era of various kinds of totalitarian governments being tried out. Anyway, one last thing I want to say about this is that Rousseau does think there are some limits, as far as they go, on the sovereign's power, right? The sovereign, the general will, there are some things that it can't do. In the first case, he says that the general will is always general, as the name implies. It's always general and it's never specific. What that means is, that means that the general will isn't in favor of any sort of law or political policy in particular. It's always stated in sort of a general statement. So, for instance, think about this. Think about that. About 10 years ago now, they were drafting and arguing over the Affordable Care Act. Obamacare, right? And people were arguing about the question of, I want health care. I mean, people need health care, but is this the way to do it, right? And that's a great question. It strikes right at the heart of this first limitation, is that the general will would be something like the society wants the least well-off to be better taken care of with regard to their health care. Right. It's not in favor of the specific policy of the Affordable Care Act, right? So politicians are in this funny spot with regard to the general will. They are in a position of having to sort of actualize it, having to write laws that reflect the general will and try to give the general will what it wants. But this is going to be an ongoing sort of art project because there's going to be no piece of legislation that is going to perfectly map onto the general will, because the general will doesn't get that specific. It doesn't get that granular, right? So even within Rousseau's scheme here, there's going to be a lot of ground for political disagreement. There are going to be a lot of grounds for people to argue over, well, now, wait a second, that's not the best way to do it. Here's the best way to get what we really want, right? Right. So the next limitation on the general will is that Rousseau writes that the general will cannot take more than is necessary to satisfy the general will. So going back to my example of the bridge, if the general will in our society is that, well, we need, it would be good for the society to have more trade abilities outside of just the market here. It would be better if we had open lines to foreign trade, right? And let's say the bridge is our specific way of trying to actualize that general will, right? Imperfect as it is, we're going to try to actualize it through building that bridge, right? And to build that bridge, we need to take some people's land, right? Well, if that is what is needed to satisfy the general will, then those people's land is forfeit, right? Then they have no grounds for objecting. All rights need to be put or up for grabs with regard to the general will. But you can't say, okay, well, you have to give up your land, and also you have to give us all the money in your bank account, right? You can't say to those landowners, right, you have to give us up all your land, and also you have to work as slaves on the building of the bridge, right? We're going beyond what it takes to satisfy the general will. The general will is being satisfied by the bridge, and we need to only do the things that are going to result in that bridge, and anything over and above that is just, it's excessive, it's gratuitous, right? So those are then the limits of the sovereign's power. It is always general, it's never specific, it's never in favor of some specific plan or specific law or specific politician. It's always very generally stated. And the second one is it cannot take more than is necessary to satisfy the general will. You can't take somebody's land and then also take all of the money in their bank account and make them work as slaves. You only take what is necessary to satisfy the general will. Okay, so cool. Why is any of this necessary? What is the so Rousseau thought that he was in favor of collective rights rather than individual rights. Why is this important? Well, Rousseau has quite a big historical footprint, both directly and indirectly. Directly in the rather unsavory actions of the Jacobins during the French Revolution, a little bit after Rousseau dies, the left wing of the French Revolution in the late 1700s, they are fanatics about Rousseau. Especially his let's all go storm the castle bit, right? So his influence is very direct on the French Revolution, right? His theories are a little less directly inspirational on a major political movement in the 1800s and especially then the 1900s, the 20th century. And that is socialism, right? That's Rousseau's emphasis on the good of the group at the maybe even the expense of the group of the good of the individual, and the need of the individual to sacrifice for the good of the group, and the right of the group to force the individual to sacrifice. Is going to be very influential on later socialist movements, right? And what we see now coming out of the 1700s going forward is we can see sort of two main kind of lines of philosophical lineage from Hobbes, right? There is the Locke line that emphasizes individual rights and gives rise to the old US of A, USA, right? And then we can trace what could be called the Rousseau line, and that is a line that goes kind of off, maybe in the left direction. Switch sides there, but no, it goes the Rousseau side goes off in the other direction and emphasizes collective rights rather than individual rights, and inspires the socialist movements and later the communist movements of the 20th century. The communist movements of the 20th century were, let's say that they were compatible with a lot of Rousseau's theories. It's going too far to say that they're inspired by him. I don't know how much Stalin read Rousseau. I know Mao probably didn't. But anyway, So that is the end of Rousseau. What we are going to read next is we are going to read a 20th century writer, Claude Ake. He's writing the later half of the 20th century, just about 30 or 40 years ago. And he is going to talk about the problems of Africa and the problems of the political problems in Africa in the 20th century, and how he thinks they are related to the social contract tradition and the tradition of human rights in the West. So, okay, see you next time.